Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted these online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Let me take a moment to preview our upcoming webinars for this month. In 2020, we produced altogether 33 webinars, one per week beginning in June 1. And we plan to have a similar schedule this year. Next Monday, the topic will be unions in the new economic reality. And speakers will feature Bill Fletcher and Jane McAlevey. The following Monday, the webinar will be on ending the pandemic slump. Is MMT the answer? MMT is modern monetary theory. Marxist economist Michael Roberts will be our speaker. And then we wrap up January on the 25th with a special tribute to the late Leo Panitch, who died last month. Well, that's what's in store for our fans during this month. Today, our topic is combating racism. The past year saw the largest sustained protests against racism in the nation's history. Blacks and whites demonstrated in the streets of hundreds of cities and towns across the country, specifically against police violence, but it was the systemic racism so pervasive throughout US society that became the focus. Will 2021 finally be the year when systemic changes will actually happen? Well, three philosophers, all active in anti-racism struggles, will discuss combating racism. Our first speaker will be Fred Evans, Professor Emeritus in the Philosophy Department at Duquesne University. He's the author of several books, most recently, Public Art and the Fragility of Democracy. Following him, I will speak. I taught for 40 years at historically Black Morgan State University. A founder of the Center for Global Justice, I've published two books, Moving Beyond Capitalism and Recreating Democracy in a Globalized State. We are fortunate to have as our third speaker, Lewis Gordon, who's written extensively on Africana and Black existentialism, post-colonial phenomenology, race and racism, as well as the thought of Frantz Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois. He teaches at the University of Connecticut, where he heads the philosophy department. An early book of his was this, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism. He's published many other books since then. His newest book, just out, I believe it was scheduled for release January 1, is freedom, justice, and decolonization. So following presentations by our three speakers, then there will be Q&A where you'll have an opportunity to share your comments and ask questions. Well, let me now turn the floor to Fred Evans for his presentation. Unmute your mic. Fred, you have to also unmute your mic. You were focusing on screen sharing, but down in the lower left-hand corner. There you go.
Okay, can everybody hear me now? Is
Yes.
it unmuted? Thank you. So I want to thank the Center for Global Justice and Cliff Duran, Bob Stone, and Betsy Bowman for inviting me to participate in this panel on combating racism. My contribution is a 15-minute talk based on an article still in progress entitled Black Lives Matter and the Fortunes of Democracy. Black Lives Matter describes itself as a decentralized political and social movement, and as a global organization in the US, UK, and Canada, whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. Because Black Lives Matter describes itself as a global organization and is having a great impact on world affairs, I break my presentation into 4 parts, as is indicated by the image on the screen. The global context of Black Lives Matter, the US context of Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter's structure and aims, and then fourthly, what I think are 2 innovative implications of Black Lives Matter for the ethos and practice of democracy. So to begin with part 1, the global context on Black Lives Matter. I want to say the global context today involves 3 related forces. The first force is neoliberalism, or market fundamentalism, as the current political economy of globalization. It subordinates all other social values to the accumulation of capital and creates extreme inequality between and within the nation states of the globe. The second force, neo-fascism, numerous political economists have shown that neoliberalism's engendered inequality has given rise to neo-fascist movements. For example, Bolsonaro's Brazil, Duterte's Philippines, Putin's Russia, and Trump's United States, to name just a few. The third force is the progressive democracy of the political left worldwide and in the US. It denounces both neoliberalism and neo-fascism. So we have then neoliberalism, neo-fascism, and progressive democracy as constituting the global context for Black Lives Matter and other progressive social movements. So moving on to part 2, the US context of Black Lives Matter, the New York Times Magazine 1619 project declares that there are 2 historical dates that are pertinent for the beginnings of the US. Not just July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, but also August 1619, which marks the first shipload of enslaved Africans brought to the North American colonies. If we put these 2 dates together, we have a history of the US as an unfolding struggle between oppressor and oppressed for 3 different periods: pre-US Constitution, post-US Constitution, and the US today. Because of time limits, I'm going to skip the pre and the post-Constitution and just move on to today. With today, we have the Trumpist neo-fascism as the oppressor versus progressive democracy, including Black Lives Matter, in the corner of the groups oppressed by Trumpism. Now, I call Trumpism neo-fascist for the following reasons. It's a combination of 3 practices: bigotry, authoritarianism, and thuggery. on three different levels: rhetoric, political policies, and political appointments. It's abetted by Trump as president, by the leadership in the Republican Party, and by right-wing media, religious groups, and vigilantes, all favoring white supremacy for either ideological or pragmatic reasons. In contrast, progressive democracy denounces both neoliberalism and Trumpism. Democratic senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren add that promote universal health care, free university tuition, living wage, Green New Deal, and progressive taxation on wealth as well as on income. Sanders adds that his democratic socialism, quote, will address the racial disparities of wealth and income and root out institutional racism wherever it exists, unquote. So there's a direct overlap between the progressive Democrats and Black Lives Matter with respect to the issue of racism. So moving on now to the third part, Black Lives Matter. It's the structures and aims of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was founded in July 2013 by three Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Guyors, and Opal Tometi, in protest against a vigilante who shot an unarmed 17-year-old Black teenager, Trayvon Martin. On May 25th, 2020, Black Lives Matter gained international recognition through its leadership in the protest against the brutal murder of George Floyd. Some of the main aims of Black Lives Matter are defunding the police, perhaps that means more radically reforming than completely eliminating the police, but defunding the police in that sense. And then second, attaining economic and social justice. And third, achieving equality within the Black community for segments of it that the community itself has marginalized, Black homosexuals and Black transgender people. And then fourth, confronting systemic racism, which I understand generally as the institutionalized sacrifice of Black well-being for the advantage of white society. More specifically, and according to the racial justice organization Race Forward, systemic racism against Blacks and others consists in the wealth gap, employment, housing discrimination, government surveillance, incarceration, drug arrest, immigration arrest, and infant mortality. To fill out these Black Lives Matter aims of the Black Lives Matter further, I want to appeal to the contribution of two Black intellectuals who are allied to Black Lives Matter and with whom many of you are familiar, so Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kendi. In his book, Between the World and Me, Coates says abstract phrasing such as racial chasm, racial profiling, and whiteness, quote, obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth, that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body, unquote. Elsewhere, Coates says that white supremacy is the social force behind this violence to the body, and, quote, so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine the country without it, unquote. He adds that this racist ideology cannot be terminated by reducing American poverty or closing the achievement gap, because an injury gap still remains. That is a pervasive and seemingly permanent discrimination in employment, in wealth gap, and, quote, in treating Black people as sub-citizens, sub-Americans, and subhumans, unquote. To repair that injury, Coates feels that the Black community deserves governmental reparations in order to close the gap, but also to engender, and I think this is a very interesting statement, but also to engender, quote, a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history. In other words, linking 1776 to 1619 and attaining the anti-racist, multicultural, multi-ethnic society that so many of us in the US desire. The feeling of hope for that kind of society comes up in a still more recent statement by Coates. He's impressed by the ethically diverse youth that have allied themselves with Black Lives Matter. He says, quoting him again here, "It is possible then that for the first time in American history, a legitimate anti-racist majority is emerging and thus giving birth to a world beyond founding father idolatry, where we can seek not merely to defeat the incumbent president, but to erase his entire philosophy out of human existence," unquote. Now, going over now to Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he covers 18 areas in which there is a form of racism and its anti-racist antidote. These areas form, quote, "a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equality and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas," unquote. One simple example of an anti-racist idea that he mentions is racial groups are not inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Another anti-racist idea, according to Kendi, is that racist ideas in general have their source in the self-interest of powerful policymakers who then produce racist ideas to defend and rationalize the inequitable effects of their policies, unquote. This production of racist ideas then leads to everyday people consuming these ideas and exhibiting the ignorance and hate that follows. So anti-racist action for Kendi then aims to change self-interest racist policies and to call upon all of us to be anti-racist, whatever one's race, and to be against whatever traits of racism still reside in policies and tendencies we may have adopted and now must challenge. So Coates and Kendi overlap in their concerns, but Coates, with a desire for a revolution in the American consciousness, puts an accent on attitude, whereas Kendi puts his accent on policy change. And I think the importance of this type of difference will become a little clearer in Cliff's presentation that follows. So moving on now to part 4, the innovative implications of Black Lives Matter for democratic ethos and practice. So I want to appropriate from Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari some of their terminology and ideas, in particular the idea of minoritarian, the minoritarian. And according to them, the minoritarian is opposed to the majoritarian standard that dominates society. Deleuze and Guattari capture that standard with a hyphenated phrase, and it goes as follows, quote, "The average adult dash white dash heterosexual dash European dash male dash speaking a standard language," unquote. We can take this hyphenated phrase as equivalent to the combination of neoliberalism and white supremacy with which we are dealing. So the minoritarian action deterritorializes, undoes this majoritarian hegemony, releasing lines of flight that constitute the opening up of society to new possibilities. In its turn, the majoritarian force, neoliberalism and white supremacy in this case, attempts to re-territorialize these deterritorialized possibilities back into its axioms. But according to Deleuze and Guattari, the majoritarian force ends up simultaneously generating novel forces that disrupt these axioms. Deleuze and Guattari's minoritarian idea, I think, fits well with the non-hierarchical organization of the Black Lives Matter network. with it and its affirmation of gay, lesbian, and other Black groups that are marginalized by the Black community itself, and with its acceptance of non-Black groups as allies. And finally, fourth, with its allowing the meaning of Black Lives Matter to remain in continuous variation or creative becoming. If we carry over the ideas of Black Lives Matter as a minoritarian minority, as continuous variation or creative becoming, to the broader idea of a progressive and anti-racist democracy, we endorse society as a unity composed of difference, rather than the homogenizing unity that white supremacy and neoliberalism impose on diversity. So a unity composed of difference as opposed to a unity imposed on difference. As a form of solidarity, this progressive type of unity is expressed by the common affirmation of a particular political ethics in three parts. The first is commitment to socioeconomic and political equality. The second, a valorization of three political virtues, solidarity itself, but also at the same time, heterogeneity and fecundity, with fecundity as the creation of new voices through the dialogic or agonistic interplay among the other voices of society, which would be equivalent then to that idea of affirming unity composed of rather than imposed on diversity. And then the third part of this political ethics is resisting any return to neoliberalism or neo-fascism and racism, any attempted re-territorialization of this political ethics. So in summary then, the first innovative implication of the Black Lives Matter model is to think of democracy and progressive social movements as creative becomings. One's always open to experimental discoveries of what democracy could be in its unfolding history. Now, the second innovative implication for democracy comes from Black Lives Matter being both a singularity and a universalization at the same time. The singularity dimension of Black Lives Matter consists in the unique experience and history of Black oppression. Oppression is a general word, but there are many different kinds of it and many different responses to it. So the singularity focuses on that. The universalizing dimension of Black Lives Matter is best introduced by an observation. Many whites use as a retort to Black Lives Matter the phrase, all lives matter, and then dismiss the idea of systemic racism against Blacks. But it seems to me the utterance Black Lives Matter does not mean only Black Lives Matter. It means Black Lives Matter too. And African Americans are demanding that the value of their lives must now, at long last, be recognized by society as a whole. The word too also indicates to me that Black Lives Matter can be, and is already, a model and an inspiration for similar calls to struggle. The refrain, Black Lives Matter, can be recast when needed as a formula, X lives matter. Like an algebraic sign, the X can be replaced by another name. For example, immigrant lives matter, or indigenous lives matter, or disabled people's lives matter. In this sense, Black Lives Matter provides a model that is universalizable. To reiterate this singularity universalizable combination and add a bit more to it, the name of a marginalized group can replace X in the refrain at any moment in history. The substituted name preserves the singularity of the group it designates and the particular form of inequality it is undergoing. The Lives Matter part of the refrain, plus the substitutable X, constitutes the universality of the phrase. It also signals progressive democracy's commitment to the desired universality of the three types of equality, economic, social, and legal, for whichever group is marginalized in the society and whenever there is such a group. The task for activists is to make this call for the ongoing demarginalizing of marginalized groups part of the ethos of democracy. and the practice of special government institutions and or non-governmental, nonprofit civics groups. So to return now to the global situation, which we started this talk, the Lives Matter refrain holds for marginalized countries as well as communities within countries. So the global aim of cosmopolitanism then is first, global socioeconomic and legal equality. Second, replacement of neoliberalism and neo-fascism with a form of progressive democracy, a democracy that is always a creative becoming. And third, replacement of the three vices of bigotry, authoritarianism, and thuggery with the three political virtues of solidarity, heterogeneity, and fecundity. That is, a unity composed of difference instead of a unity imposed on difference. So to conclude then, Black Lives Matter has as its primary aim the liberation of Black people, but it is also a model and a spur for how a particular society or a world could become the multi-ethnic and multicultural society, the multi-voice body that so many of us say we want national and world society to be. So that's the end of my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Okay, my turn now. Let me begin with a few basics. As Linda Alcoff and Charles Mills argued in an earlier webinar, racism is systemic, embedded in the institutions and policies of our society. If we are to make progress in combating racism, the social structure in which it is embedded is where our efforts need to be focused. In addition to this structural racism, there are also prejudices that infect the minds of individuals and may influence their behavior. But it is more than a cultural phenomenon, as important as that may be. While prejudices can be irritants in social interactions between individuals, they are of secondary importance. In circumstances where these subjective factors converge with institutional power, as in the case of hiring decisions or police interactions with Blacks, they can result in serious and even fatal consequences. In any case, attitudes are largely the consequence of structural racism. So it is with the latter that social change must begin. Besides, structural racism produces cumulative disadvantages that result in widening inequalities. Another basic point: race is a social construct, not a biological fact. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist or have real consequences. A race is a collective entity of individuals that are grouped together by a social convention. They may be grouped by skin color or other physical characteristics, or by common ancestry, or even shared historical experience. Blacks are said to be identified by Black skin tones, but in fact, many are as light as those who are said to be white. If being Black means one's ancestry came from Africa, and being white means they came from Europe, how do you classify those who have both African and European ancestors? A large number of those grouped as Blacks have some European ancestors, many even more than 50%. But even a drop of African blood makes them Black by social convention. Yet a drop of European blood does not make them white. The arbitrariness of racial groupings is clear from the above. Social constructs are fluid, and with race in particular, they conceal power relations. Racist institutions embody power over blacks to their disadvantage and the advantage of whites. Blacks suffer from discrimination, while whites benefit from white skin privilege. Does that make the advantaged whites racist? Not necessarily. It is the institution that is racist. The white who receives benefits is being racist only if he chooses to deny them to blacks. But he doesn't have to refuse the benefits. However, morally, he does have an obligation to seek to extend the benefits to others, regardless of race. Consider the example of a white motorist who is stopped by the police. He expects to receive fair and courteous street treatment. That may be a white skin privilege. We know that blacks motorists are too often treated very differently. How could the white motorist renounce his white skin privilege? Does he have to demand to be treated in the same threatening way as blacks are? No, of course not. No, he has to insist that black motorists be treated the same way as he is. That is, he has to be an anti racist. The same can be said of other advantages that whites take for granted advantages in hiring, lending, healthcare, housing, schooling, etc. Whites need to become aware of these as privileges denied to others for him to become an anti racist. A racist is not someone who just benefits from racism, then. It is someone who promotes or defends such discriminatory benefits and denies them to others. This is a point that is missed by Robin DiAngelo in her widely read book, White Fragility. DiAngelo tends to see privileges whites enjoy as racist because they are not also bestowed on blacks, rather than seeing them as benefits that all should be entitled to. Racism is their denial to blacks. For example, she lists the following as granted to whites, quote, self-worth, visibility, positive expectations, psychological freedom from the tether of race, freedom of movement, the sense of belonging, and a sense of entitlement to all of the above, close quote. I would argue that all humans are entitled to these benefits. Yet she goes on to suggest these are unearned advantages that whites enjoy. It seems to me the problem is not that whites have unearned advantages, but that blacks have unearned disadvantages. DiAngelo is too quick to charge whites who benefit from their position in the social system with the sin of racism, especially when someone isn't moved to a confession of guilt, as if they were responsible for the benefit they received. This is particularly disturbing to white liberals who do not think of themselves as racist. Politically, her move is counterproductive. Rather than enlisting the person she confronts into the anti-racist struggle for systemic change, she attacks them as racist. In the face of such attacks, they often break down, demonstrating what she calls white fragility. I would argue that it is only after systemic racism has been fully exposed that one can say that silence equals racism, as protester signs have been saying. Only then does silence become complicity. For example, a racist is the one who seeks to prevent blacks from moving into his white neighborhood. But how about his white neighbors who selected to live there simply because it was a nice neighborhood with good schools for the children. He is his is a privileged position, but he's not racist. However, what if he is made aware of his privileged neighborhood and secure property values, that they are due to racial steering by real estate agents and redlining by banks? Does that mean he should give up his white skin privilege and move elsewhere, perhaps to a poor slum? No, he's only under an obligation as a moral person and a citizen to act against those racist policies and perhaps seek to integrate his neighborhood. That is, he is to become an anti racist. As I am not responsible for the advantages that I did not seek, so too I am not responsible for the past oppression of others from which I benefit today. I'm not guilty of the crimes throughout history that created the world in which I now find myself. The land on which I live was stolen from the original peoples. The wealth of the nation was built on the backs of slaves as well as wage laborers who were exploited. All of that made possible today's level of, of, um, of material civilization I enjoy, we all enjoy. However, I cannot be guilty of the crimes of my ancestors, but I am responsible to act with others to redress these wrongs, seeing they do not continue today. I am to be an anti racist warrior for justice. One other word about Robin DiAngelo. I suspect the limitations of her approach results from the social context in which she does her racial sensitivity workshops. She is hired by a company to improve interpersonal relations between employees, not to change company policy. So racism ends up as being an individual failing rather than an institutional problem. By blaming individuals, she lets the institution off the hook. And by labeling the individual as racist, there ends up being little change there as well. While she reports numerous examples of individuals who demonstrate their fragility by breaking down, has her method yielded any successes? There is only one success she cites, namely herself. Even that is limited, as she inadvertently offends a Black colleague. The real injury of racism does not lie in interpersonal microaggressions, but in the institutional. Mending the former may make for smoother relations with others, but that does not change the harm done by institutional practices. And pushing white liberals to the point of breaking down only alienates them from the anti racist struggle. Far better to enlist them against racist institutional policies. Another basic point about race has to do with racial identity. As a social construct, others place you in a racial group. They identify you as Black or white based on physical characteristics or ancestry or some other racial marker. That is your social identity. But that does not mean you have to accept it as your own self identity. To be sure, social identities can shape how you are treated and can have a powerful influence on how you think of yourself. But that is still, but there is still an element of choice. Others may identify you as white, but you do not have to accept that as your own self identity. That is, You do not need to identify yourself with other whites. You can be a race traitor. You can refuse white solidarity. Not everyone who is identified by society as a member of the group it calls white thinks of himself as belonging to such a group. The same cannot be said of blacks. African Americans have experienced a long history of racial oppression and of collective struggle against it. That collective struggle has forged a collective identity of blackness that is likely to be internalized as one's own self identity. Historical struggles have forged a black culture. Blacks know themselves as black in a way that whites do not know themselves as white. Black consciousness is a near universal reality. White consciousness is not. That's why when someone is granted privileges due to his skin color, but does not consider himself entitled to any skin privilege, then can he recognize the injustice of its denial to another of a different skin color. It is this contradiction between ascribed social identity and self identity that can make for an anti racist. Of course, some with white skin do self identify as white. They self identify as white. They identify themselves as members of a privileged racial group. That is who they are. For them, race is a facticity rather than a social construct. Such white supremacists or white nationalists see their essence as different from racial others. If the larger society do not accept this essentialism, they feel this as a rejection of who they are. They often react violently against what they conceive to be an existential threat. They are then the true racist. This is the ugly face of racism we see today. Black Lives Matter is a call for equality. But we should be clear what that means. It is not a call for a classless society. It is a call for racial equality. That is, for equal treatment within the existing class divided society. It is a call for equal access to positions, benefits, and treatment regardless of race. Insofar as access to these is by a competitive process, they are to be earned, so they are merited, not ascribed by race. When racism disadvantages those of the stigmatized group while giving advantages to those of a privileged group, a class division takes on the character of a racial division. Thus, an achievement oriented society that claims to be meritocratic also takes on an ascriptive character. That's how you get racialized capitalism and a structural inequality along racial lines. A socially constructed group becomes frozen into a caste. That doesn't mean there is no class mobility in racialized capitalism. There may be upward mobility for some blacks, especially if they are light skinned, but they have to be 150% qualified to get past the racial barriers to advancement. And even then, they are seen by race conscious whites as black. In a society without racism, individuals would be placed in the social hierarchy based on other criteria, not by racial group membership. But there could still be great inequality. The struggle against racism is at bottom a struggle for meritocratic inequality. And I will rest with that and turn the floor over to my colleague, Lewis Gordon.
Thank you, Cliff. And thank you, Fred, for your presentations. For those of you who are joining us, welcome. Alito, buenas tardes, and depending on the time, it could be buenos dias. Shalom, salam alaikum, and welcome. I'd also like to extend my condolences because we're living in a period in which there are just so many people just dying. And even those who are not dying, there's so many who are just suffering. And as we all know, we're going through this as a stark realization of incompetence, and where it's not incompetence, malevolence. I say this, of course, because we're dealing with the problems of not only putting stupid people in charge, but there are also some people who are in charge who know exactly what they're doing. They're committed to policies that would lead to misery and the loss of life for so many. And so many right now, as we know, the underlying theme of the moment is summarized from a recurring expression that we have heard time and time again from Black people. And that is simply, I can't breathe. Now, my discussion, we're speaking for a short time so we could hear from many of you, those of you who are on YouTube and the community who's joined in on Zoom, some of whom are good friends I'm delighted to see. So the short statement is what I'm speaking about is why the fight against racism is a fight for democracy. Simply that. But to say that is not so simple. So, Cliff, I think you have to mute your mic as you move it. There's some good. Thank you. So as we proceed, I'm just going to get straight to the point with a variety of issues. The first thing, of course, is that in a way I'll be giving a critique of the way we tend to talk about racism and combating it. The two preceding speakers are not guilty of those maledictions. And I mention this not to be polite, because some people know I have no problem just speaking out what I hear. But one of the things we should bear in mind is that we tend to want to talk about this issue in a very reductive way. Quite often when we bring up issues about race and racism, there are people who would just stay silent enough just to tell you what they wanted to say in the first place and didn't listen to a damn word you may say. But part of this is also the very grammar of how we tend to talk about people, about society in general. And some of this is connected to the fact that we tend to want to do it reductionistically. So some people don't want to talk about race unless you can reduce it to something other than race, whether it's class, gender, sexuality, etc. And there's also a long history of a very neurotic way to talk about race. And the neurotic way is basically you are permitted to talk about racism or race so long as you delegitimize your talking about it. Now that is neurotic. It's a lot like saying you could only talk about chemistry as long as you're forbidden from talking about the elements, or biology as long as you're forbidden from talking about life. Now, of course, what's tricky here is when we talk about race, it's not only that we're dealing with suspicion from the beginning, but also that point I said about reductivism. And I could just put it this way. Nobody has ever seen a race walking, a gender walking, a sexuality walking. All of these things are manifested together in any human being we'll see and any social relationship we may have. So it means we have to draw upon our resources of thinking and speaking in a way that actually puts us in tune with something that's really feared by racism. And what that is reality. In fact, often in my courses and in my speech, my lectures point out that, the biggest fear, if we want to talk about races, of all races, is not actually whether we love them or hate them, because at least they're getting attention. The biggest fear is their irrelevance. So, how do we get to their irrelevance? Well, first thing I'd like us to do, and I'm going to move very quickly, but we could speak more later. First, we look at our contemporary situation. Because you see, one of the ways we fail to see things is if we isolate ourselves in such a way that we proverbially look at the finger rather than what the finger is pointing to. And we fail to look at the fact that we are connected to each other. The contemporary global situation is one such reality with which to deal. Because our contemporary global situation, in one in which we're dealing with two fundamental conflicts about global reality. The first one is one that was inaugurated in what we call Euromodernity. And that is, you see, if we get rid of the reductionism, when Columbus landed in the Bahamas, it wasn't about seeking knowledge or special routes to India. It was more than that. It was a conflict that was going on between Christianity, Islam, notions of theodicy, who belongs, who doesn't, and ultimately, they all coalesced in a variety of theses that continued that, and underlying them was the spirit of war. And in the spirit of that war, the idea is who should survive and who should not. And that took a form that moved inward and inward and inward until an understanding of what it is to be a human being was such that it devalued other human beings. And that connected to a conception of the human being that was so private, so privatized, that we have inherited this on a global scale in what not only Fred, but also Cliff talked about as neoliberalism, which has as its mantra privatization. Now, neoliberalism with its mantra privatization also has neoconservatism, and neoconservatism basically it opens the door to neofascism. But elsewhere, I've talked about the details of that. For here, all I would like to bring up is that this model of radical privatization made global has dominated our understanding of global reality. And if you privatize global reality, you radicalize inequalities, and you'll create a world in which there are few haves and many have-nots. Now, on the other side, there's the radicalization of public access. The fact of the matter is that if we radicalize public access to our planet, to our communities, to each other, we have a world in which we've distributed power in such a way that this comes down fundamentally to the question of democracy. Because to radicalize equality, which is not identical, by the way, with sameness, if we radicalize equality, we could create a situation in which access to institutions of power becomes global. Now, racism is antithetical to democracy, because all racism is premised upon an allergy to difference, and a valorization of sameness. And this is why even when racists use the word democracy, they're ultimately talking about a homogeneous model in which it collapses upon the self as the standard and the ideal. But as we know, there's a certain point, if you're only dealing simply with yourself as the standard, if you're simply dealing with that, then ultimately, even your so-called homogeneous community is not homogeneous enough, which is why all right-wing groups, all racist groups ultimately turn upon each other. Now, I want to say something that some people, that is not fashionable in liberal democracies, and particularly in places like the United States, because the United States, as an example, and also Britain or the UK, they have a way of talking about these issues that ultimately evade them. And that's because they moralize these issues. They set themselves up in such a way that they individualize them. And so the thing I'm going to say that may bother some people is, I really don't give a damn that there are racists in the world. What bothers me is that institutions of power are placed in their hands. If they were disempowered, if systems of power weren't designed to maintain that particular framework or those particular individuals, then they become completely irrelevant. There'll just be some blotch in a room. And if we think about it, there are many people in the world, it's really funny how, if we pick whites as an example, it's interesting how the mentality around how to talk about racism is so invested in trying to keep white people happy when we do this. Yet if we think about it, it's not the end of the world for many white people, for Corey in Australia, or a Maori in New Zealand, or so many disenfranchised, disempowered Black people hate white people. It won't change the daily life of white people one stitch. So often when we talk about these issues, what we fail to do, and this is because this is one of the expectations of liberal democracies, is for us to talk about these issues without talking about power. And it's because of this failure to talk about power, that leads to another failure. Because there's a way in which in liberal democracies, we're expected to talk about political issues, but submerge them into moral issues, and in effect evade the issue of the fact that politics and power are intimately connected. You must have power for political reality to work. And because of that, racism is a political problem. Now, as I said, I'll move very quickly. One of the things that we should bear in mind is that, first of all, if we talk about racism, the main thing we have to put on the table is that racism is a lie, just in a nutshell. Racism is basically to convince you to believe things you don't ultimately believe. And the reason I could say this is because for racism to work, it has to identify human beings. Racism is against human beings. Racism is not about dogs and cats and trees and houses. Racism is something against human beings. But it involves identifying human beings and then deny their humanity. So in this process of denying their humanity, it requires a variety of shifty stuff, double standards, playing around with things. So for instance, the double wedge is, if we look at, I'll just use white and Black for now because it's easier, but I talk about many kinds of racism in my work. But if we talk about white and Black, it's to treat the positive in white as a norm and the negative as an exception. But when you look at Blacks, it's to treat the positive in Blacks as the exception and to treat the negative in Blacks as the norm. And because of that logic, there's a presupposition that any rational person should never want to be Black. And I could tell you as a Black person, I don't get up in the morning wishing I wasn't Black. I get up in the morning perfectly happy being a Black person. What always strikes me when I look at many people who are white is the extent to which many whites live in a delusional world. Because many whites live in a world that ultimately is a theodicy of rationalization of a system that on a daily basis is dehumanizing. So this brings us to the question of the fact that racism is linked to misanthropy. Now, why do I say misanthropy? Well, you see, if we go back to what capitalism and war and a lot of these models that I elaborate in some of my writings are involved in, they involve in pushing away the human being as a being that's in relation, as a relational questioning of being and reality. In other words, community, connectedness, etc., and set up the self-sustained individual as if that individual were a god. And this is one of the reasons why racism is also a form of narcissistic rage against reality. Because you see, reality always reminds us that it is greater than we are. It requires a form of humility in which we understand ourselves as always not the entire story. And where there are people who would remind us of that, the narcissistic rage involved in racism often results in making those people into problems. So I begin first with pointing out a very simple point. There's a distinction between white supremacy and anti-Black racism. White supremacy has its own logic, and it does result in the diminution of the value of Black people, but not only Black people. However, one can reject white supremacy, but maintain anti-Black racism. And this is one of the problems we've been suffering with. Because you see, as long as what is animating the mechanisms, the institutions, is not necessarily the notion that whites are superior, but the view that Blacks or a group that function like Blacks must be evaded at all costs, it can result in ongoing mechanisms that can actually bolster up something like white supremacy. And this involves the logic of making people into problems. Now, W.B. Du Bois and many others have talked about this. And the short version of this is W.B. Du Bois noticed something, and Fanon, Richard Wright, Anna Julia Cooper, many others noticed this. And what that is that in a racist society, racially subjugated peoples are treated as problems. But in treating them as problems, they are dehumanized, because what happens is in treating them as problems, they're treated as the cause of what they suffer. As a consequence, what Du Bois and many others pointed out is that there need to be the understanding of such people as human beings who face problems rather than are the problems. But when we understand that people face problems, that means we put the society under account. And this is where it becomes the difficult issue to deal with. It's really striking when one looks, as Fred was bringing up, but we look at the history of the Euromodern world. And one of the difficult things for many people to do today, because of a long line of propaganda and ideological imposition against reality, is just a very basic fact. That however you may think of yourself as a white individual, whiteness is marked by a profound narcissism. And the narcissism can be summarized in two ways. The first way is, I remember when I was speaking with a doctoral student who was talking about certain issues around gender diminution, and she had presumed certain things about men, and I asked her to look at the Mayo Clinic's list of narcissistic disorders. And when we went down the long list of descriptions of narcissistic disorders, it was striking, and she began to crack up because it was a detailed discussion, not of what an individual white person is, but what we think of when we think of white people structurally. White people structurally are those who are born with the presumption of superiority, born with the belief that they have a right to everything, born with the belief that it's unjust if they're deprived of anything, and the list goes on and on. But we already know what happens if you were to raise a child starting with the premise that she or he is superior to everyone, must get everything she wants or he wants, must go through the world where at any moment that is deprived, it's an injustice. You'll raise a schmuck. And the fact of the matter is that once we begin to think about this accumulation of stuff, we begin not to see certain maledictions. Quite often, for instance, when we study discourses on human nature, we're not discussing human nature. We're actually studying white people. And that's because most social scientific research present as human nature the behavior of predominantly white young people who are freshmen and sophomores in colleges in white countries across the globe. And a lot of these things that are presumed ordinary behavior map on neatly to what's considered a rational human being under capitalism. But the truth is, a de facto everyday ordinary white person, black, brown person, anybody you choose, is not exactly that kind of person. However, when people buy into these stereotypes, they believe they should be such. So I'm going to move quickly through some themes that, given those premises, we should consider. Now, the first one, beyond once you've made people into problems, is we could see how moralism comes into play. Because you see, whenever you talk about racism, if you're going to cultivate a moralistic mentality into people, morality tends to focus about people's character and what they are. And that's why so many whites, when we talk about racism, take it personally. And one of the big tasks is to remind a lot of white people that it's not about them personally. It's not about who you are individually. It is talking about a very structure that sets things in place in such a way that it offers a misrepresentation of reality as if individual white people are like gods. But if we focus on that, here's the problem. You can get a bunch of white people arguing with a bunch of non-white people, a bunch of white people feel bad, and then a bunch of white people go home to a structure that's made intact in their favor, and the non-white people go home to a bunch of structures intact for their disfavor. So the big problem with the moralistic model is it doesn't focus on the central issue, which is this is not about what people are, this is about what people can do. And if we're dealing with political issues are ultimately about what is to be done. And this is why some of the things, for instance, that Cliff brought up about the privilege discourse is correct. Because you see, the issue, if you look at a lot of things that are being called privileges, it's very peculiar under neoliberalism when we begin to describe things that turn out to be rights. People should have a right to healthcare, being treated with dignity, clean water, food, education, etc. To treat those things as if they're luxuries would be problematic. The issue is not that whites have those things. The issue is that non-whites are deprived of them or often violently attacked by whites when exercising their rights to have them. History is full of the lynchings, the deprivation, the burning down of Black businesses, communities, etc. Many of what it just even takes, even with a person like me with my stature, what it takes just to step into a car and drive. The way in which the police have the overwhelming evidence of police violence, not brutality, because brutality presumes legitimate use of force, just used in excess, but violence. The idea that the main goal is to dehumanize, deprive, to stop me, to put me in my proverbial place. Every time I step outside my home, I face that. The idea that every Black person deep down knows, even if you're in trouble, do not call the police. That means we have to deal with a basic, uncomfortable fact that the police is a created phenomenon, and we could create something better if we want to live with dignity and freedom as human beings. So I've often argued that when we want to talk about white supremacy and we want to talk about racism, instead of privilege, we should talk about license. You see, a license doesn't have to be something good. It doesn't make sense to say you have the privilege to murder, maim, rape, steal. That doesn't make sense. But you can have the license to do that. And in fact, if you look at the history of the United States as an example, but there are other countries. You see it in Brazil, you see it in Argentina, you see it in the treatment of Dalits in India, that the centered group has a license to be able to commit even murder and get away with it. When Trump signaled he could shoot someone in Midtown Manhattan and get away with it, it was a dog whistle, a code to white supremacists of the good old days, as they saw it, when they could do anything to people of color with impunity. And the thing about it is, if you have a license, it means that you can get away with it. This is why I was having a conversation earlier with a colleague where I was pointing out, it's crazy how many crimes white people commit a day, because I also studied law. And I remember when I was teaching, when I teach criminology, I would ask my white students to describe a typical weekend. And they would, and then I'd show them that they have committed at least 103 crimes. But what every police officer knows is that they could just look the other way. Because the truth is, society functions perfectly well, even when those crimes are committed. The purpose of many of the police officers' actions is that double standard I talked about. It's to use it as an act of terror, all the way from spitting gum on a sidewalk to jaywalking against Black people. And so the thing is this: if you're handed a license to kill, to do whatever you'd like, you could make a decision, then nobody should have that license. Nobody. And so that now gives you the opportunity to work with those who don't have the license to make sure nobody has such a license. The real issue with racism, in other words, as a political issue, is that it involves the question of license that nobody should have. And precisely as a white person could fight against having a license of whiteness, which is different as being defined as a white person, which is different from your individual moral character, that means you can act. And this is where political action comes in, because this forum is about combating racism. And what's the point of our meeting if we don't talk about what people can do? And if we keep sight of the fact that it's around political action, we know what we can do. Vijay Rashekar, a Dalit thinker, brought it up very well. He pointed out that in racist societies, such as what we see in Southwest Asia, there's a problem of integration and assimilation. Integration involves the legal jurisdiction over a people. So everybody, including Native Americans, say, as an example in the United States, or if we talk about Mexico, if we talk about Brazil or Colombia, that's the integration. But the problem is that the model of assimilation is premised upon becoming the licensed or the centered group of people. And that's the thing to eradicate. Because you see, if you're a Dalit in India and you have to be assimilated only as a Hindu, even though you're not a Hindu, it means the only way you could enter is untouchable. Similarly, if you're going to set the condition of actually belonging to the United States that you be white, what the hell are you going to do if you're Black? What are you going to do if you're indigenous? What are you going to do? So this, once we point to the political problem premised upon difference makes a distinction between equality and sameness. Assimilation in those models requires sameness, but political action for democracy requires understanding that you can be equal, but not the same. So this brings to the forefront the problem of political responsibility, with which I'll close. Because you see, liberal political theory, liberal models of democracy, because they're so wedded to capitalism, have the notion of an individual that is so disconnected from relation as the model of humanity that it makes the moral supervene over the political. It becomes more a conversation about what I am morally instead of what we are to do politically. But if you think about what you're to do politically, now you're in a language that connects not only to people like Fanon, but also Karl Jaspers, Iris Marion Young, many others, and it's a position to which I subscribe. Political responsibility is not the same as moral responsibility. Because you see, political responsibility goes directly to the question of power. Because you see, if we understand power as the ability to make things happen and access to the conditions of doing so, the purpose of political action and political reality is to set the conditions through which people have greater options through which to live with dignity and freedom as human beings. And this question of political responsibility is at the heart of what's part of radical democracy. Because radical democracy reduces the privatization of the planet, which links into questions not only of the question of police, but of the environment, of the economies, of the many ways in which we're able to act in such a way that we expand and we empower humanity to do something about the conditions under which we live. But this leads to the crucial and the difficult question when one is involved in combating racism. There are some people who are cynical when they looked at the many people who took to the streets last year in 20. I'm glad to be able to say last year. But the thing that many people miss, you see, the old discourse of people taking to the streets was based on the selfishness model. That's why, for instance, I'm Black and Jewish, but a lot of people like to use the Blacks and Jews in such a way that they make Jews white, which is very problematic. And then they put in there a logic of it's for their own interest. But I've always argued the reason to go to the streets is because it's right, and it's connected to a larger political commitment. And one of the things the pandemic did is to bring so many people into a quarantine situation that they began to focus more on the need for sociality. In this forum, we're physically distant, but we're not socially distant. Neoliberalism likes social distance. They're not the same thing. Physical distance means we're not exchanging our droplets, but we're using this technology to be socially close, to learn, communicate with each other, and build institutions through which to transform the world. Well, the crucial thing is when George Floyd, when people were able to witness this, they saw that his life was being extinguished for a mundane act of going outside. And what we begin to realize, and what makes this different, is that the many groups who have walked out into the streets realize, especially when we saw what Donald Trump and his minions did, just to be able to hold up a Bible by putting tear gas and even planting a heat ray on the people, is that we're fighting against forces that fundamentally are against democracy and the empowerment of people. So it's not that those whites who have joined Black Lives Matter, who have joined with many people across the globe, even in the midst of all this, there were people in Syria who went out on the streets with a sign that Black Lives Matter. The point is that Black lives become a metonym for really saying democracy matters. And this is not to translate it out, it's to bring in the fact of dealing with the irreplaceability of what's involved with political action. But here's the thing. When we act from political responsibility, there is a point at which we cannot see those in whose relationship we're acting. We can't see the subsequent generations who will inherit the benefits of the conditions of our action. And what this tells you is that political action is not from the narcissistic model in which you are going to love those who look like you or like me, but that political action is ultimately reaching for those who are anonymous, those whom we'll never know. And that is a love that is based not on similitude, but on difference. And that difference can only be enacted upon from something crucial for political action. And that is, it's not about its optimism or its pessimism, but political action is first and foremost about commitment. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louis. Another very provocative presentation. Now we turn to your comments, your questions of the speakers. Now, some people are watching this on YouTube, and those on YouTube don't have any direct way to get a question or comment to us, except by sending it to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. So if you shoot me an email with your question or comment, I will pass it on to our speakers. If you are in the Zoom room with us, you can ask your question directly. And I will put my screen on gallery view so that I can see everybody who's in the Zoom room. And if you want to speak, what you need to do is turn on your video so I can see you, and then just wave, wave frantically, and I'll call on you. And I see the first question coming that way by Richard Jones. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, Cliff, Fred, and Louis, thank you for your talks and your eloquence and your wisdom. My question will be to try to sublime the three talks. So it'll be one question, but aimed at the three of you. And so my reading of DiAngelo and Wilkerson and these books that are very popular now all have one theme in common that I see, and that is a call for radical dignity. And this call for radical dignity, I mean, this is the one thing I took from DiAngelo's book that I thought was a positive, this call for radical dignity. And so my question becomes, given the Fred Evans oracles of the heteroglossia, monoglossia, the oracles, who are the oracles in education, the media, etc., who can bring about this mediated kind of communication that leads to radical, this kind of radical dignity that should exist. And so I heard Louis speak of this kind of dignity that is required to overcome this kind of racism, that to lessen this narcissistic tendency and this anti-humanism that exists in white. So my question then, compressed into something that's manageable, is who is to teach whites what they need to know to allow radical Black dignity? Or is radical Black dignity something that Blacks can achieve without that lesson being taught? Who would teach that lesson, and what is that lesson? Is it anti-narcissism? Is it that the whites need to become more invested in political action, as Lewis so eloquently put forward? Is it one of Fred Evans' oracles that can teach this lesson to bring about the multicultural, the multi-voiced political body? And so that's my question.
Richard, I don't I from my first, all the way back from when I wrote Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism through to the present, I've always found the saving whites argument, especially whites at the level of virtue, ethics, and morality, a dead end. It's just a big dead end. What I was ending with was something a little different, which is I could give a different analogy. You know, Audre Lorde is very famous for many things, but one of them was an expression: "The master's tool can't tear down the master's house." And I've always argued that she was wrong. And people are shocked, you know, because, you know, there's an exoticizing of Black people. So for instance, the narcissism I talked about is not exclusive to white people. It's just that it's a norm that dominates Euromodernity. So Black people, for instance, can manifest this narcissism when we adopt those views. I remembered I was speaking with a student who had written a chapter of a thesis in which he was trying to explore what white people want, and he went through all kinds of elaboration. And I said in the examination, you know, a lot of Black people have written very well of what white people as a group want, and we didn't have to go through all that gymnastics. And he asked, "What was it?" And I said, "Oh, everything." And it's not that there aren't Black people who want everything, but most Black people just have specific things. You know, we'd like to not have the cops do things to us. We'd like to have access to we'd like to be able to just walk out in the world and say it's a nice day. You know, we have more modest goals, but to be white, properly white, really white, is to want everything. So if we go back to Audre Lorde said the master's tool can't tear down the master's house. And my response is, well, I mean, if the master's house is the only house in town and you tear it down, okay, fine, now everybody's homeless. It seems to me a better model is to build better houses, other houses. If you have a bunch of different houses, the master's house is irrelevant. In fact, it doesn't matter how much he beats his chest and says, "I am a master." If everybody's partying in the other houses, who cares? And that was the basis of my opening remark. You see what I'm saying? If we concentrate so much on the master's house, we fail to build better houses. I think radical politics, the aim for radical democracy, is to build better houses, better institutions of how human beings organize themselves globally. We need to get rid of all of this crap. Nation state models, get rid of presidents and all that stuff. We have the capacity, humanity has the creativity and capacity to deal with our tiny planet, this tiny speck of dust in a cloud of dust, in a more creative way that can actually enable us to live better. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be utopia, Shangri-La, but it can be better. And if we do it well, the subsequent generations can say, thank God they acted. I think Fred and Cliff may have something to say.
Yeah, Fred, if you unmute yourself.
Oh, there we go. Takes me a while to figure it out. Richard, I really appreciate the question and also your uses from our other talks, other interactions we've had. One thing there's, and this will fit into the answer about that I'm trying to give about dignity, but when I talk about the multi-voiced body, the oracle actually is that which tries to shut it down. It's, for instance, it's the one true God, the pure race, patriarchy, capital, anything that takes its discourse as being non-revisable and not open to change. So the way I would now try to bring, if I think of dignity as a kind of relationship, then I like to use this Greek notion of parrhesia, which means two things. Usually people think of it as just the fearless speaking, to speak truth to power, for example. But there's another side of it. It's also courageous hearing. That is where you hear someone else, not just to dismiss what they're saying, but you hear it in a way that you're open to it having influences on your own discourse and leading to changes. So I think dignity shows up in this relationship where we're actually really going to hear the other person rather than simply just to dismiss, and where we're also going to speak the truth to the other person. So that's the way I would try to answer that. And I thank you for the question, because I hadn't really thought of it that way before. So thank you.
On this, Richard, it was great to see you here with us today. But on this question of privilege, I think for in a diverse society, I think, for example, of Bolivia, that defined itself as a pluricultural society, not a society in which everyone was the same, but one in which there were differences. What it made it possible for that definition of the society to be established, of course, was the political power of the indigenous people who had been excluded from power. And when they came into power, rather than saying, well, now we rule over others, they said, no, we want a society in which it's okay to be different. As the Zapatistas put it, a world in which many worlds are possible. But the problem was that the whites who had been used to privileges saw that as a denying them of their power, their power to be dominant over others. And so this question, you can create a legal framework in which it ought to be possible for those who have been privileged to still be able to enjoy a decent life without oppressing others, but they need to be educated to accept that before it becomes viable. Are there other questions or comments? Come now, okay, Gail Presby, if you unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I put a long question in the chat. I can try to tell you. And it's basically to all three of you, I loved your talks. It's so helpful. I want to share these talks with my students also. But Louis, you said, oh, it doesn't bother me if individuals are racist, as long as they don't head positions of power. And so my question is, what about today when racists are basically engaging in solidarity with each other, although I don't know if you'd say don't use the word solid, but don't the racists work with each other to create a network and to convert others to their view? And I very much liked the idea you said, Louis, how it's just based on a lie, the idea that good actions by whites are the norm and bad actions are the aberrations, and the other way around for immigrants, Black lives. But that's exactly what, for example, Trump and the Republicans and so much of their messaging leading up to the election in 2016, as well as now, was reinforcing this idea, terrible immigrants are going to come across the border and rape and butcher Americans, seen as white Americans, I guess. and this whole demonization, and they use it as a mill. And their coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement as like Black people want to burn down, you know, good property owners, private property, and so they have a coordinated message, and they're recruiting people much more than we would like to see, because look how close these last two elections have been. And while we're breathing a sigh of relief about 2020, it's only a little sigh, because I mean, this view was close to winning. Of course, this view also organizes itself to change the rules of democracy so that they have a chance of winning. But that's also their coordinated effort, which to a certain extent, they've been able to do or build on the past racism. So how do we reach out to so many Americans today? And Cliff, I noted you said, don't do it by making them feel guilty and disempowering your allies. How do we reach out to people and say, this Republican message is erroneous and toxic, when so many of them have been reinforced in this message in the past 4 years? And they'll see Trump as a hero instead as a thug, as you've said, instead of thuggery. How do we address this nationwide propaganda? Thank you.
Well, perhaps we can look to the example of Bernie Sanders, who reached out. He went on Fox TV. He did a town hall with Trump supporters, and what he did was point out to them the ways in which existing policies were harming them. That it wasn't just a matter of Black people or immigrants that had produced a situation where their social status was increasingly precarious, but it was policies that were being pursued by the political elite. And he got a very positive reaction from people. Unfortunately, the media has not amplified that kind of larger perspective, and has thus contributed to the miseducation of those who now have been identified as among the 74 million Trump voters.
Gail, the first thing I would say is one of the reasons I began by talking about the multidimensional and
Excuse me, Gail is speaking, and Gail doesn't have her.
No, it's the Center for Global Justice. That one needs
Bob,
to be.
Betsy, you need to mute your mic.
And they'll see Trump as a hero instead as
Mute the mic.
Please mute your mic so you don't talk over everybody else.
There we go.
Thank you.
The reason I opened up with a multivariate, multidimensional approach is because one problem we have is we're often looking for a singular methodological framework through which to deal with certain problems, but the human world is dialectical and multivariant. So that's a more complicated way of saying we need all hands on deck. The thing to bear in mind is that there's so many things we do today that our predecessors would have found impossible. And we're able to do them today because of political action. Yes, they're out there organized, but we have to bear in mind that they're not only out there, but they're highly funded. The very rich elite are using their capital behind them. It's always been the case that to fight more for democracy requires people working together who don't have a lot of resources. If we think of the women's movement as an example, it's just not even in our imagination anymore that we would walk into a classroom to teach people, let's just take race out of it, who are exclusively males at universities. And it's always shocking when I have to explain to students that for many of the students we have, even today, in some of their classes, the women professors who are teaching them are the first women ever hired in their departments to teach. It's that, you know what I'm saying? And given I can look before us, the ages of us, even with me, you know, people like Pat and me here and you, that's really recently. Those are transformations on the level of gender in our lifetime. But that happened because women and men took to the streets, took to the courtrooms, took to every facet of every institution of power to affect them, and we're still fighting. Every one of us know who's been in a university, there's not been a moment since I've been in the university, not been a semester in which I've not had to deal with a gender issue. Do you see what I'm saying? And I'm talking about people trying to disenfranchise women, colleagues, students, etc. It's a similar thing with race. So the thing, and every time we move forward, there are forces trying to pull us backward. But this is why I ended with that argument about political commitment. Because in the end, we have to have multi-stages of struggle. We have immediate, obviously, the elections, but that's not the only one. The truth of the matter is people like many of you have never went away. Those who were involved in the struggles from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s have kept going, but you're dealing with each different dimension. Some of us do it globally. Some of us are in the United States, but some of us are doing things from South Africa to India, all the way through to Chile, you name the country. But the idea is this is a global struggle. It's just that no one individual can wage it. We have to do it in multi-layers. And so, yeah, they're absolutely there. But the truth of the matter is, even if they maintain their beliefs, if the configurations of power are transformed, there is a situation in which they're more disposed for different beliefs through varieties of contact until you're dealing with the radically pathological. And that's a whole other matter. But again, that's where we're getting in. And there are psychoanalysts and others who are getting into certain issues. For instance, one of the big problems, if we use the United States as an example, many other countries have had women heads of state. Many have. Many Caribbean countries, even the very racist, sexist UK. But the fact of the matter is the United States has a psychoanalytical problem with founding fathers syndrome, because the United States has this view, it is one of the only countries that treats people as pathological if they don't have fathers. It's bizarre, to the point where for many people in the United States, whether it's a loving father, Bernie Sanders, or an abusive father, Donald Trump, as long as they're fathers, they're happy. And that's why you could have a phenomenon of people who said they'd vote for Bernie or Trump, which is bizarre. So there are many factors. And what we do as theorists, academics, et cetera, we look at the factors. But on an everyday level, people have to fight struggles from different dimensions of where they're at. And if I think of my late mother did union activism. My late mother did things around children in the community, but my late mother was also involved in national politics and did whatever she could, even though she was a really underpaid clerk in a hospital, you see? And this is the error we make. The thing we forget, and if we think back even the struggle against enslavement and Black liberation struggles, a lot of people like to talk about the grand figures like the Malcolm X's, the Fanons, the Martin Luther Kings. But in a lot of my public lectures, I like to talk about the Harriet Baileys and people like those, because these were women and there are men like them whom most people don't know, but their actions made a world of difference and they had no way of knowing it. Because in the end, you know, Harriet Bailey, for those of you who don't know, was Frederick Douglass's biological mother, okay? And she was an enslaved woman She had, the world told her nothing she did could matter. But some of her efforts to reach her child, because, slave children were separated from the mothers at birth and so forth, what she was able to do, and she did not know he was going to become Frederick Douglass. She didn't know about the repercussions down the road, but her actions did matter. And what I like about Alicia Garza and the Black Lives Matter women, these are queer Black women. A lot of people don't even know that Alicia Garza is Jewish. She's a Black Jewish woman. These women had no reason to know that a hashtag or whatever, they were long-term activists. There are a lot of people told them they make no difference. They had no way to know. But we know this much. Had they not acted, at least that dimension of the conversation, we would not be having. So nobody really knows in advance the implications of their action, but they need to act on their commitment.
Yeah, Fred wants to comment on that, and we have a couple other questions coming up. Again, Fred, you have to
Got to unmute, Fred.
yourself.
Oh, there we go. No, I keep, at any rate, first of all, Gail, it's really good to see and hear you again. It's been some time. I agree with both Cliff and Lewis's response. So I just want to add a kind of a different angle to it. And it takes me back to something that Senator Fulbright said during the Vietnam War. And when he talked about the leadership in the US at the time that was committed to the war in Vietnam, he said, there's a problem here of ignorance and arrogance. And he felt that the leadership in the US was ignorant and asking arrogantly. And it was clear we were very ignorant about the Vietnamese and we were very arrogant about what could take place there. And I kept thinking of when he said that, when the pandemic came up and people were refusing to wear masks or refusing to do the spacing, I kept saying, yeah, there's a kind of ignorance and arrogance here, almost a willing type of ignorance. And so how do we deal with where that seems to be something that some of the 70 million that voted for Trump and Trump himself and the people who seem to actually comport themselves in that way of buying into ignorance and arrogance and supporting it. And I point that out just to see how difficult the problem is. It doesn't seem to be thoroughly what we call rational or reasonable. There's just a willingness not want to hear what the rest of us have to say, except that, and I'll go back to Cliff's example and to Lewis' example, when we have when I'm getting confused in my own words here for a moment, but when we have politicians that I've got a block actually on a name. This is kind of embarrassing for me. Sanders. I speak of him all the time, so why I got the block, I don't know. But when Sanders speaks, the reason people hear him from both sides, from the 70 million that voted for Trump and the rest of us who voted against him, they do it because he speaks of equality. And he says, whatever your side you're taking, I want equality for everyone. And there's kind of an openness then that he gives to everyone, at least to hear him. And I think that's one of the avenues for trying to deal with this. I call it sometimes a metavirus. You've got the coronavirus. Well, here's a metavirus, the virus of ignorance plus ignorance plus arrogance. And I think that this is one of the ways that speaking truth about equality can help bridge that gap. Sorry to have spoken in such a muddled way. I just get occasionally I'll get a block on a name and I can't get it back. But Sanders would be my answer.
For those folks in watching on YouTube, let me give you one last chance to get a question in by sending an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I do have one question there, which I'd like to pass on to our speakers. And this comes from Jerry Fastrup. He says, it seems to me that racism in the US is intimately related to conservative white Christianity and the failure of Reconstruction and the ability of racism to maintain its power in our political institutions to this day. Please comment on white America's need to just be honest about our history, accept it, and have the resolve to move forward. Okay, white Christianity is bastion of racist conservatism. Any comments?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is thanks for that question. It's one of the things I was hinting at earlier on when I said that we have a tendency to want to find the one element when there are many. And one of the things we should bear in mind is not only about the history of the United States. I'm trying not to be U.S. centric in this, but it's also the history of Christianity. You see, a lot of the Christianity we understand today is from a long misrepresentation of Christian history. Today, many people think of Christianity in terms of love and caring and blah, blah, blah. Christianity's history was a history of war. It's a very brutal religion that massacred people, tore down temples of pagans, burnt libraries, cultivated ignorance, etc. And we have to remember that the conflict that was going on that led to Columbus's landing in the Bahamas was called the fight to defend Christendom. And actually most of Europe almost became Afro-Muslim if it weren't for Charlemagne's victory over the Moors in southern France. So there's a lot of Christian history Christians don't know. It's worth shocking. Years ago, when I taught at Purdue, I remember when I was thinking, I'm in a Bible bit. Let me use examples from the Bible so I could connect with my students. To my shock, a typical student didn't read a stitch of the Bible. They all went to church, but they don't know the Bible. They know what preachers tell them from the pulpit. And so if we come back but one of the things in Christianity, that model of Christianity is theodicy, and the idea that evil must be made external to God. And idolatry imbues that in creating a subject to correlate with capitalism and Christianity and a variety of other forces, to the idea that there's a people with regard to whom evil is external, which is what produces the notion of evil people, problem people, etc. When it came to Reconstruction, it's not that Reconstruction failed, it's that there was a real concerted effort to destroy the project of Reconstruction. W.B. Du Bois chronicles it very well in Black Reconstruction. And what Du Bois pointed out, for instance, that one part of this leads to a concerted misrepresentation of history. Because you see, the damage is not only what we have materially, the material inequality, the political structures, but also epistemologically, that we have inherited a way of producing false knowledge to people. And this happened historiographically. For instance, many people don't realize that the North was able to win because of Black soldiers. It's just a fact. It was Black soldiers who got in there and fought. If the former enslaved and the freed Blacks from the North had not fought in the Civil War, the Confederate would have won. Just fact. And but of course, the way Black history is presented to most people, not in the United States, but globally, is of Black people as passive objects of history, as if white people fought for our freedom and just handed it to us and things failed. But not only there, even the history of enslavement. Most people think of enslaved people as a kind of passive labor walking around in jungles, picked up and kidnapped and brought over. It's completely false. Most of those African enslaved people were skilled labor. They had knowledge of everything from agriculture to medicine. They were literate. They weren't illiterate. 30% of enslaved people, for instance, read the Quran because they were Muslim. There were Black Jews. There were also people, Yoruba, Ibu, well-schooled people. But why I bring this up is because they brought that knowledge to the New World. A lot of the technological resources, all the way through to the filament in the light bulbs we're using right now, were invented by Black people. Most people, here's one of the disparities of history, and that's how it affects that question. When white people fail, they call it human nature. When white people succeed, we call them whites. And here's the problem. When all of these histories from Native Americans, Black people to South Asians, etc., their achievements, their contributions, what happens there is they're erased in that story. Because you see, ultimately, all achievements are human achievements. But the crucial point is that we need actually to teach real, true, accurate history. We need to have a better understanding of many of the people, what was involved, what are the mechanisms from economies to technologies, all the way through to new types of social relations that play a part in that. And here's the thing, we can do it. And the reason we know this is because, connected to Gail's question, the counter-revolutionary forces, all the way from the Daughters of the Confederacy, really invested a lot of time and effort in the misrepresentation of history. They control textbooks to secondary school teachers, and students. They affect what's taught in university classrooms. They affect what's even taught in philosophy departments. So it's very important for those of us who are waging this struggle. Also, even though I'm very critical of the way people talk about epistemology, but generally, because they talk about formal epistemology, but there is, at many levels, an epistemological struggle to be waged. And part of it is to bring forth a more accurate representation of history and the forces at work through which we have come to what we have today, but also implicit in it, what we could create for tomorrow.
We're running short on time, but I think we can fit two more questions in. Bob Stone has a question, and David Rouse. Bob, unmute yourself.
I'm Nosy Lewis and others. Gail and Richard, wonderful to see you all. And Fred too. I've been reading a Mexican philosopher named Bolivar Echeverria. He's one of the real original thinkers, needless to say, very on race. He holds the view that white supremacy is on the march in the world, and it's being pushed forward by capitalism. Bolivar, who is now dead, studied in Germany and argued that the color of capitalism is white. And the globalization of capitalism, as we've seen since the 80s, has also globalized white supremacy, whiteness. And I like this hypothesis because it helps to understand the differences between US and Mexican racisms. There's no one drop rule here in Mexico. It would not work, but there is racism. How do you get that? Well, mestizaje, the condition of being mixed, is the root condition of being Mexican. It's since 1910, the revolution empowered colored peoples in this country. And mestizaje, the 80% in the middle of, were some amount of both indigenous and European blood, 10% at the top, unmixed Spanish descent, 10% at the bottom with indigenous. But the racism is in the preference for lighter mestizaje, más moreno, menos güero, and that seems to be the case in a lot of other parts of the world, where you look for a a preference for lighter mestizaje, más moreno, menos güero, and that seems to be the case in a lot of other parts of the world. I'm getting a feedback here from my radio preference for lighter mestizaje, más moreno.
Whoever is Frank should mute.
Sorry, I'm looking for the control.
And that seems to be I worked in the civil rights movement in Mississippi in '64, and we got the vote for Black people in the South, which is now raising all sorts of hell in Georgia, thank God. But it left aside this phenomenon of white supremacy, which seems to me to be deeper in U.S. history. But now we raise that issue where you got white supremacy global. That's a global phenomenon. So I think that I'll send it around if people would like it. I have a translation of Bolivar's essay on images of whiteness, in which he advances this. It's a hypothesis, but I also think it's a fundamental insight into the essence of global white supremacy. And so anyway, I wanted to share that and advocate Bolivar's work, and which I'll be glad to share.
Okay, comments from Louis or Fred before we move on to David?
Well, Bob, that author is catching up to a lot of what a lot of us in the Caribbean Philosophical Association have been talking about those ideas for more than 20 years, and the history of those formulations go back more than 150 years. You could find it in Haiti, in Anthony F. Eman. You could find it, that's more a scholarship issue. You could find it also in Du Bois. This is one of the reasons why early on I made a distinction between white supremacy and anti-Black racism, because they're not identical, though they are consequential. One thing, though, that we should bear in mind about white supremacy and why capitalism is crucial here, and it connects to Gail's question again earlier. I always give this example. Even if you have a small number of people in a room who represent a certain position, if they yell the loudest and they have access to a bullhorn, they can seem like they are the dominant group in a room. One of the things that capitalist support of white supremacy has is capital. And as a consequence, the access to the forums they have in many countries all across, because I travel across the world regularly, except since the pandemic. And what you find is consistently, like Fox News, they could be the loudest in the room. And that gives them the illusion of being more than they are. They're able to do the damage because of that. But we should bear in mind that most people on the planet are dealing with very different kinds of concerns and issues that at times they get swept up in the policies created by those individuals having the pulpit or, et cetera in the room. The other thing is we already see that, especially with the GOP in the United States, but also what you see in Hungary and you see in Russia and what you see in various other parts of the world, including Brazil, the capitalist-supported white supremacists depend upon disenfranchising others. That's why they have to fight against democracy, because the truth is they're not a representation of the majority. But they do have capital.
Okay, yeah, Fred.
Just to say, Bob sent me that paper some time ago, and I finally read it last night, and I think it is a very significant paper. And I just wanted to second your appreciation of it.
Okay,
Elected.
okay, David Rouse for our last question.
Yes, working in the ministry in Kentucky, teaching at Cal State Bakersfield, and then teaching at UVA Wise. In all three of those cases, I had students who came from sundown towns, towns in which no Black better be in that town after sundown. Racism is a geographical problem. Lewis has touched upon this a little bit, but most of our conversation has treated racism as a kind of global problem. I'd like for you to address any of the three of you, racism as a geographical problem.
I kept starting the first time. Fred or Cliff, you want to talk first? Because all
Go
three
ahead.
of us are global travelers. David, the question you asked as empirical import, and one of the things I found, I usually point it out in two ways, because I am also a professor of Jewish studies, and I always point out that everywhere I go in the world, people think their Jews are the Jews. And it's similar with when we talk about race. Everywhere I go, people think their Blacks are the Blacks. Whereas I've been all over the planet, and Black people are really different in many places. Just end of story. And it's hard for many, for instance, US Black people to believe there are Black people who get up in the morning not hating themselves and are not actually running around worried about what white people think of us. Okay, but there are many Black people all over the world who do this. The geographical part, why I say it's empirical, is because if you go to the countries, you see these things. What you would discover is that because imperialism, Euro-modern imperialism, it was wedded to capitalism and a philosophical anthropology of the derision of people who are not considered the ideal capitalist subject. Because that was made global through colonialism, there is racism all across the globe. So the geographic terrain is global. What is different is the history of the resources rallied against it and how people are able to respond. And so, yes, there are sundown towns, including in New England. And one would find, I have to point out, even when I give analyses of police violence, that there's something about how police was created in the Euro-modern world that make, even in all Black countries, police in their actions structurally racist. Because if you're a white person in Jamaica, or a white person in Senegal, or a white person in Kenya, the police, the Black police, or a white person in India, the Indian police, will treat you in a very different way than they would the local people. And that is one of the vestiges of colonialism. But as we deal with these elements, there are nuances and complexities about how people would talk about these issues. So for instance, if I'm dealing with Dalits in India, Dalits also identify as Black people, Southwest Indians. If I'm dealing with Koori in Australia or Maori in New Zealand, again, in that context, they know their indigenous language, etc., but they are Black people. And as they talk about the mechanisms of policing, of economic control, of miseducation, those are all the technologies that I'm thinking here in terms of Fred's presentation as well, when he talked about Guattari and Deleuze, but also Foucault, but there are others who talk about these technologies. Du Bois did as well. These are the technologies, and Fanon did in his psychiatric studies. These are the technologies of how one has to corral a misrepresentation of reality for a system to function. You see? And so that's what a sundown town is. It's not just simply about sundown. It's about to create in the very consciousness of any Black person an association with the time of day in which they're to be absent. And beyond that, there are many other examples of this, but they're all connected. If you think about the history of qualifications discourses, you know, one of the things I often have to explain to many people who are new to the academy, as an example, you know, the old academy had nothing to do with merit. The old academy was basically a bunch of white guys who got on the phone and called up a bunch of other white guys and got their white friend hired. It's when women and Blacks and Indigenous people had to come in, they had to create standards. And now we have this fictional notion of a day when there was all this merit. And when we come up, people are talking about qualifications, etc. But it's all BS. But of course, those discourses, of course, is to put us into questioning belonging. And this is a crucial element of all racisms. Wherever you are, racism, ultimately, it's not one thing, but among them is the question, do you belong? And if you're on the outs group, it doesn't matter even your skin color, because as you know, there are light-skinned Black people in the world. It doesn't matter your skin color. If you don't belong, if you're in the out group, you don't belong. And the consequences of not belonging, the technologies come into place, from violence to the very logic of the very questioning of your right to exist.
Okay, Fred, do you have any final word? We need to wrap this up.
There we go. Just to say that I have lived in a number of other countries, and in Laos and Southeast Asia, I worked with an organization called International Voluntary Services, and I was there for 5 years, and then later in Colombia. And there were issues of race there just as strong as they are here, but with a lot of differences. It wasn't always based on color, but what ethnic group you were and what language you spoke within it. So yeah, we're talking about something that is both universal and localized at the same time, and that's going to call for a lot of effort and thought to overcome it.
Yeah, in that vein, I would simply point out that, you know, that racism is the language of power. That power needs to identify those over whom they have dominance. And that identification is often articulated in racial terms. I think, for example, in the case of China, the Uyghur people in Xinjiang are white. They're a European people. And yet the Han Chinese, who are the dominant ethnic group nationally in China, see them as an inferior race to be dominated. You know, and that racism is a way of rationalizing that political domination. Well, with that, I think we need to wrap this up. I want to thank our speakers for very stimulating 2 hours. Fred and Louis, it's been a delight to be with you in this discussion. And I hope that, oh, by the way, some of you have, I see that, oh yes, we have one donation that has come in during this. Let me encourage others of you to, this is from Nathan Ekstrand. I want to thank Nathan for his donation that helps to support these webinars and invite others to also contribute. Our next webinar, next Monday, will be on unions in a new economic reality. Will feature Bill Fletcher and Jane McAlevey. We've had Bill in a couple previous webinars, and I think that if you're familiar with him, you'll find him very provocative. As the United States moves into a new administration that will hopefully be more friendly to unions than the outgoing administration was. The role of unions in the economic reality that we now face with under COVID is a very relevant topic. So I hope you'll join us again next Monday, same time, same place. And for now, this is Cliff Durand signing off. Ciao.
Ciao.